All right, ladies and gentlemen, there has been a ton of news lately for Wuthering Waves 2.1, and some of the most exciting yet is something that I wanted to share with you all today, and that is official news on Phoebe's signature weapon, Luminous Hymn. And we've got 2 images prepared for us by Kuro Games that'll give us a brief rundown of what exactly this weapon is going to do, who some of its best wielders potentially will be, and, of course, the big one, perhaps the most important one of them all, whether it's worth pulling based off the state of your account. As we all know within Wuthering Waves, at least in the Tower of Adversity in the present, weapons are shareable in endgame content, but with the new Whimpering Waste coming out, it turns out that weapons might not be as shareable as we thought. And so even if you're somebody, right, who is thinking about using String Master on your Phoebe, well, it turns out if you're going into Whimpering Wastes, you might not be able to use String Master on anybody else if you're planning on bringing like a Jeju or a Yinlin into that game mode. And so now there is a much bigger use case for having a second limited 5-star weapon, especially a signature one, on your account, and Phoebe's is the very first that we're going to be looking at, considering some of the new limitations there might be. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's get right on into it. First things first, we saw this from our demo, it's going to be a book surrounded in cards. It is one of the most visually pleasing signatures I think we've had since the release of the game, and they got a short little tagline for it. The Sentinel's Grace, how sweet thou art, our home, whatever. Let's get into what we actually care about here, and that's going to be first and foremost the weapon's base stats. And let me just say that these weapons base stats are a little bit interesting, especially given the character and the Sonata set that the character is going to be using. Based off of what we're seeing over here, this weapon has the identical stat profile to what many consider one of the best signatures in the game, and that is String Master, ladies and gentlemen, because String Master has the exact same base stats of an attack of 500 and a massive crit rate of 36%. Not even looking at the weapon effect itself, String Master's massive 36% crit rate allows us to have a lot more freedom in our echo substats and our overall building, because you can easily miss a lot of critical rate substats and still have a pretty decent ratio on the character. However, one thing to keep in mind is that, well, Phoebe's best set is actually going to be on Eternal Radiance, and this is going to result in some weird things with her build. We can clearly see that this has a built-in massive 36% crit rate, and this Spectral Frazzle set is also going to have a massive built-in crit rate of, well, 20%. And so right off the rip, if you equip this weapon on Phoebe, you max it out, and you use her on the Spectral Frazzle set, well, you're gonna have a 56% crit ratio just from the effects. Give her the 5% from base, and she's going to be at 61% crit without you building a single substat in her kit. And so from that point of view, a lot of people might have preferred if this weapon actually had a critical damage substat or critical damage secondary main stat, and, you know, was a bit more similar to Jeju's, which has the same exact attack, but instead of a crit rate of 36%, Jeju's weapon has 72% critical damage. And so there might be some really big concerns with overcapping in the crit rate on your Phoebe's build, and you're just gonna have to see whether or not, you know, how that cookie crumbles from there. Because if she does have critical damage stats in her tree, like Camellia, for example, and has critical damage instead of critical rate, then we might find that her stats are already going to be a little bit easier to balance so that you don't overcap on critical rate. But do keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, just based off of how this weapon is working, if you roll a critical rate substat on all of your Phoebe pieces, then there's a pretty good chance that you're already going to overcap. So maybe focus on things that are a little bit more damage oriented. Now, getting into the weapon skill itself, and ladies and gentlemen, this is kind of like where all of the importance is, especially for a weapon like this, which is in direct competition with String Master. It's going to be called Home Builder's Anthem, and across all of its various synchronization ranks, we're just going to be reading out one. It's going to increase attack by 12%. This attack bonus in most cases is pretty much strictly worse than a general attribute damage bonus, like we would see on a weapon like String Master. Phoebe's signature is instead going to have a 12% increase to attack instead of this 12% attribute damage bonus. And the reason why I say that an attribute damage bonus is typically better is because you can just get an attack substat as a roll on your Echo. On the other hand, you can only get a damage bonus of a specific type on one of your your echoes. And it technically takes 4 damage type rolls all at the same value to be equal to, in this situation, right, 1 12% general attribute damage bonus. And so Phoebe's weapon, having just attack, in my eyes, makes it not as valuable at a baseline compared to those other weapons. Because again, attack is much easier to find, it's a lot easier to stack up, there are more attack buffs in the game than general attribute damage bonuses. So a little bit of a mark against this weapon, but not a huge one, especially given how, you know, her set effect might work. The next effect is a little bit more tailored. Dealing damage to enemies with Spectral Frazzle gives you a 14% boost to basic attack and a 14% heavy attack boost, respectively, and it stacks up to 3 times. So right off the rip, what we're going to understand about Phoebe is that, well, she's like a dual damage dealer. She's a dual type damage dealer. And so as you're going through and you're investing in some of her echoes, maybe you're doing a little bit of pre-farming, keep in mind that these are going to be the damage types to really focus on, basic and heavy attack. But the nice thing about this is that she's going to get a pretty substantial bonus to both of these. 14% times 3 is 42, and she's going to gain a 42% bonus from both of these damage types. It can be considered one of the best buffing weapons in the game, just from the perspective of how much total damage bonus it's giving and all of the different types that it's giving it to. However, since it is only 42%, ladies and gentlemen, you do have to keep in mind that the total bonus is going to be a bit lower than some of the other signature weapons in the game. Carlotta's, for example, gives a raw 48% to Resonance skill. So Phoebe's going to have a slightly smaller bonus, but get it to 2 different damage types. And unfortunately, she does have the restriction, especially on this weapon, of enemies needing to have Spectral Frazzle on them in the first place. However, you have to keep in mind that this can still be used on another Rectifier user who simply has a Spectral Frazzle applier on the team. So if you're using, for some godforsaken reason, like Yinlin or Jeja with Spectral Rover, they can equip this weapon and they will gain benefits from its stacking buff, because Spectral Rover is going to apply the Frazzle that can allow the other member of the team who's using this weapon to actually capitalize it and stack up its effect. But I'm gonna be honest, just use String Master instead in that situation. But if you really do need a crit rate weapon, and for some reason you do want to play Spectral Rover, that team is possible. Next, it has a final effect. Honestly, I thought that the effect was going to end here. Casting an outro skill amplifies the damage from Spectral Frazzle on enemies around the active resonator by 30% for 30 seconds. And so, as you can see, this is going to stack pretty heavily with the outro buff when Phoebe is in her confession mode. And that's going to do things like reduce spectral damage resistance. It's going to amplify Spectral Frazzle damage by 100%, and then also extend the damage dealing cycle by 50%. Basically have more ticks applied to the enemy. And, well, ladies and gentlemen, when you're applying it with this buff as well, this is like a dual purpose weapon. It'll be good for Phoebe in her DPS mode in the absolution state, and it's also going to be good in her debuffing mode when she's in the confession state by having an additional amplification effect with her outro buff here. And that, to me, really fits in with the purpose of Phoebe's character being a very dual DPS, or not really dual DPS, but dual role oriented person. One in absolution state where you deal a massive amount of damage but need a Spectral Frazzle applier, and one in the confession state where you're not dealing nearly as much damage but you're applying debuffs way more frequently. So definitely a very, very tailored weapon for Phoebe. It does have a couple of use cases on other characters, and we've sort of gone into them. However, it is time for us to go a little bit more in depth. So if you plan on using this on a character like Jeja, let's be honest over here, you're not going to gain nearly as much benefits as you would from a weapon like String Master or Jeja's signature as a whole. At a baseline, this weapon is going to be a 12% attack stat stick on pretty much every character, unless you're sliding them in with somebody that can use Spectral Frazzle. And if that's the case, Jeja does gain the most benefits out of the entire roster because she does scale off of basic attacks. Yinlin, on the other hand, well, let's just be honest here. Yinlin is going to gain absolutely nothing from this weapon, aside from the baseline stats that it provides in crit rate, as well as that 12% attack bonus. That's because Yinlin does almost no damage with her basic attacks, and pretty much no damage with her heavy attacks either. Yinlin is basically entirely resonance skill and liberation. And so I would just, if you really do desperately need something just to equip on her, this might be the way to go, but it is not worth pulling to any degree for anyone that really isn't Phoebe. Because again, that restriction of requiring a Spectral Frazzle applier on the team is kind of restrictive. It's not that restrictive on Phoebe, who can simply do it herself, but you're going to need to pair Spectral Rover with your Yinlin or Jeja to even gain access to this last part of the effect. And we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. If you do want, you could think about using it on a character like Shorekeeper or Verena, but let's be honest here. Lacking the ER from a weapon-like variation or Shorekeeper signature is going to make your character builds almost impossible to gain the full benefits of. Without an ER weapon, I am quite confident that Shorekeeper actually can't reach the 230% energy regen she needs for her crit ratios on her liberation, and Verena is just going to be an absolute nightmare if you're not at 200+% because her liberation is never going to be up for every rotation. So that kind of gets the both of them out of the way right off the rip. And for Baizha, don't even think about using it on Baizha. She needs ER desperately just to have her rotations feel somewhat normal as a character. So we've covered all of the different use cases of her weapon. It is not that good on other characters. Stringmaster is pretty much objectively better in every single way. And let's be honest here, ladies and gentlemen, the fish weapon, which is going to be free in version 1.4, is going to be a perfectly fine alternative. It's going to be a perfectly fine alternative because it's going to gain at max stacks 40% spectral damage bonus if you deal damage to enemies that have spectral frazzle. We already talked about how the built-in crit rate of the spectral frazzle Sonata set makes it so that lacking crit rate on the weapon isn't that big of a deal. You'll be able to build a very powerful free-to-play Phoebe simply by using this weapon instead. But if you do want to max her out, give her a ton of damage bonuses, and amplify her debuffing capability even more, this is going to be the way to go. But you do have a good second best option. Lastly, getting into her Ascension Materials, ladies and gentlemen. Very basic stuff. It's just going to be tailored rings from the Exiles, and again, the same helixes that you're going to be using to raise Phoebe's level. Nothing too crazy here. I'm very glad that they're still using 1.0 materials and that they're still using the 1.0 skill mats, and you're able to get a bucket load of these from basically every single event that we have. We have those premium enclosure tanks that are a great source of all of these. I haven't farmed an Exile in literally 3 months, and the game has never felt better for me. And, well, I'm just glad that they made getting all these mats so easy. Last note, I do believe I missed a character, Encore. I mean, it's kind of like the same exact situation as Jeja. Encore will be able to make use of the basic attack piece over here, but you are going to need a Spectral Frazzle enabler on the team to, well, actually deal some damage. So I would say if you do plan on using like Spectral Rover and Encore, this might work, but why would you do that when you could just use Sanhua or a healer instead? That's pretty much like using a suboptimal team comp that's just gonna feel kind of shit and forcing that in just to gain a benefit from this weapon. So I don't recommend it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will be everything for me when it comes to Phoebe's signature. I would say pull it if you really like Phoebe. Otherwise, you're not going to find as much use for it on your roster, especially compared to an existing option like Stringmaster. And I wouldn't pull it with the knowledge or the idea that you're going to be using it on very many other people. But if you really like Phoebe, go ahead and go for it. You will not be disappointed by everything that it provides. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me know what you all think about this one. Peace out.